The government claimed it was temporary, blaming sanctions and external forces, but never acknowledging the printing of money as the root cause. By 2006, inflation had reached 200%. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe continued to print money, funding government salaries, the military, and projects that they simply couldn't afford. Then came the acceleration. In 2007, inflation soared to 100,000%. Store shelves emptied, factories closed, and people fled the country in droves. The government responded by printing even more money and implementing price controls, which only exacerbated the situation. Producers ceased production because selling at controlled prices meant incurring losses. Supply vanished and prices on the black market exploded. 2008 is when Zimbabwe etched its name in the history books for all the wrong reasons. In January, inflation reached 100,000%. By April, it was 150,000%, and in June, it reached an astronomical 11 million%. In July, official statistics were discontinued because the government was no longer able to calculate the rate. However, independent economists estimated it at a mind-boggling 89.76 sextillion% annually. Let me put that into perspective. At that inflation rate, prices doubled every 24.7 hours. A Coke that cost $1 on Monday morning cost $2 on Tuesday morning, $4 on Wednesday, and $8 on Thursday. By the following Monday, that same Coke would cost $128, making it 128 times more expensive in just 1 week. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe printed a $100 trillion note. That's not a typo. $100 trillion on a single piece of paper. However, it couldn't even buy you 3 eggs. People completely abandoned the use of money and resorted to bartering, using US dollars or South African rand. Anything but Zimbabwe dollars. The country's GDP shrank by 50%, and unemployment skyrocketed to 94%. The average person lost 24 pounds due to malnutrition, and life expectancy plummeted from 60 years to 34 years in just 1 decade. Cholera outbreaks became rampant, infrastructure collapsed, and the country experienced a total economic and social breakdown. In 2009, Zimbabwe officially abandoned its currency, having printed it into utter worthlessness. The Zimbabwe dollar, which had once been more valuable than the US dollar, ceased to exist. Everyone who held savings in Zimbabwe dollars lost everything, wiping out decades of hard work. And once again, the world declared that it could never happen to them, claiming that Zimbabwe was different due to bad governance, corruption, and unique circumstances. But it wasn't unique. It followed the same pattern, the same choices, and the same mathematical principles. And just 10 years later, another country proved it. Venezuela, a country blessed with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. In 2001, they were the wealthiest country in South America, boasting a GDP per capita higher than Brazil, universal health care, free education, and a functioning democracy. Then, Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro made the same choices that every hyperinflation government makes: massive expansion of social programs without the revenue to fund them, nationalization of industries, and price controls. And when tax revenue couldn't cover the spending, they printed money. From 2012 to 2017, Venezuela's money supply increased by an astounding 14,000%. Not 14%, but 14,000%. The Central Bank of Venezuela ran the printing presses nonstop, funding government spending, covering deficits, and paying for programs that they couldn't afford. By 2016, inflation had reached 800%. Store shelves emptied, and the government blamed hoarders, speculators, and economic warfare. They implemented price controls, forcing businesses to sell at below-cost prices. Predictably, businesses ceased production, and supply vanished entirely. In 2017, inflation reached a staggering 2,600%. People resorted to eating out of trash cans, and zoos reported the disappearance of animals, which were later found butchered for meat. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, and the power grid failed regularly. The Bolivar was dying, but the government continued to print money. In 2018, the collapse accelerated. Inflation reached 1.3 million%, then 2.6 million%, and estimates placed it at 10 million% before the end of the year. At that rate, a carton of eggs that cost 200 bolivars in January cost 200 million bolivars in December. The government printed a 1 million bolivar note, which within months couldn't even buy a cup of coffee. They removed 5 zeros from the currency in 2018, renaming it the sovereign bolivar, but it failed immediately. They removed another 6 zeros in 2021, redenominating it again, but that failed as well. By 2019, over 5 million Venezuelans had fled the country, representing 17% of the population becoming refugees. Those who remained lost an average of 24 pounds due to malnutrition. Doctors, teachers, and engineers abandoned their professions, with some resorting to prostitution because it paid more. Others simply fled the country. GDP collapsed by 75%, a figure even worse than the Great Depression. Venezuela's economy shrank more than Germany's did after World War II. Oil production, the country's lifeblood, dropped by 70% because the government couldn't maintain infrastructure. Today, Venezuela has essentially dollarized, with most transactions occurring in US dollars rather than bolivars. The currency that they printed into oblivion is now worthless. And everyone who trusted the government, who kept their savings in bolivars, who believed it would stabilize, lost everything. 3 countries, 3 complete currency collapses. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. Different continents, different decades, different political systems, but the exact same pattern, the exact same choices, the exact same math. And now, the exact same choices are being made by the largest economies on Earth. Let's break down the pattern, because once you see it, you'll understand why what's happening now should terrify you. Stage 1, the trigger. Every hyperinflation begins with a crisis. Germany had war reparations, Zimbabwe had agricultural collapse, and Venezuela had falling oil prices and socialism. The crisis creates a budget shortfall, with tax revenue dropping while spending commitments remain or increase. Stage 2, the choice. The government faces a critical decision: cut spending, raise taxes, default on obligations, or print money to cover the gap. Cutting spending is politically impossible. Raising taxes doesn't generate enough revenue quickly enough, and defaulting means a loss of power. So they print money. They always print money. Stage 3, the justification. The government claims it's temporary, a bridge to better times, or invokes modern monetary theory. They argue that they're different, that they have resources, and that they'll grow out of it. The experts agree, and the central bank supports it. In March 2020, the world faced a crisis: COVID-19, lockdowns, and economic shutdowns. Governments worldwide faced the same choice that every hyperinflation government has faced: accept the pain and let the economy adjust, or print money to paper over the damage. They printed trillions of dollars, euros, yen, and yuan. Every major central bank opened the floodgates. The U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet ballooned from $4 trillion in February 2020 to over $9 trillion by April 2022. The U.S. government spent $5 trillion on COVID relief, money created from nothing and deposited directly into accounts. The European Central Bank expanded its balance sheet by over $4 trillion. The Bank of Japan continued decades of money printing, and China injected trillions of yuan. Everywhere, the response was the same: print money and worry about the consequences later. And just like Weimar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, the governments claimed it was temporary and necessary to save the economy. They promised to unwind it later, and modern monetary theory suggested that they could handle it, claiming that inflation was transitory and urging people to trust the experts. For a while, it seemed to work. In 2020 and 2021, the printed money propped up markets. Stock prices soared, real estate exploded, and crypto went vertical. Everyone with assets got richer, a phenomenon they called the wealth effect. But by late 2021, inflation appeared, and by 2022, it was undeniable. The U.S. hit 9.1% official inflation in June 2022, Europe hit double digits, and the UK saw inflation rates not seen since the 1980s. Everywhere, Prices surged for food, energy, housing, and everything else. The response was exactly what every hyperinflation government does: blame external forces, Putin's war, supply chains, corporate greed, but never the money printing, never the trillions created from nothing. And while they raised interest rates to fight inflation, they haven't stopped the printing. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet is still over $7 trillion, double what it was before COVID. Government spending hasn't stopped, deficits continue, and the printing continues. We're in stage 4, the acceleration phase. We've printed more money in the last 5 years than we did in the previous decade. The justifications are the same, the excuses are the same, and the pattern is the same. The only question is how far we'll go before the math catches up. Let's examine the warning signs, the indicators that appeared before every hyperinflation collapse. Massive money supply expansion.
Check.
The M2 money supply in the U.S. increased 40% from 2020 to 2022, an unprecedented peacetime expansion. Government deficits out of control.
Check.
The U.S. ran a $1.8 trillion deficit in 2024, over 6% of GDP, during a growing economy, during a recovery. Japan's debt is 264% of GDP, which doesn't happen in healthy systems. Rising inflation despite government claims that it's under control.
Check.
Official CPI says 3 to 4%, but real inflation, the prices you actually pay for food, housing, and insurance, is far higher. Shrinkflation, substitution, and hedonic adjustments obscure the reality in the official numbers. Asset price inflation disconnected from economic fundamentals.
Check.
Stock markets are at all-time highs while real wages fall. Real estate is unaffordable for entire generations, and wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the 1920s. Loss of faith in currency is emerging. Bitcoin exists because people don't trust central banks. Gold prices are hitting records. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems, and foreign central banks are reducing dollar holdings. The cracks are showing. Political justification for continued spending.
Check.
Every crisis is used to justify more spending and more printing for climate change, infrastructure, defense, and social programs. There's always a reason, but there's never a plan to stop. Germany thought they'd stop after paying reparations. Zimbabwe thought they'd stop after land reform stabilized, and Venezuela thought they'd stop once oil prices recovered. None of them stopped, because once you start, stopping means accepting the consequences of what you've done, and no government willingly chooses collapse. The pattern is here, and we're following it. The only question is how fast it will accelerate and how bad the ending will be. 3 times in the last century, major economies followed this exact pattern. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. Each time they thought they were different, but each time the math won. You cannot print prosperity, you cannot create wealth from nothing, and you cannot avoid the consequences of monetary expansion forever. The bill always comes due, and the only question is when. Since 2020, the world's major economies have printed more money than all 3 hyperinflation examples combined. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China are all running the same playbook that failed catastrophically 3 times before. We're told it's different this time, that we have better tools, better economists, and a better understanding, and that we can manage this. That's what they said in Weimar, in Zimbabwe, and in Venezuela, right up until the collapse. History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it echoes. And right now, the echo is deafening. We're in stage 4 of the pattern, the acceleration phase, the point where every previous example lost control, where printing begot more printing, where inflation became exponential, and where the currency began its death spiral. Maybe we'll find a way out. Maybe modern central banks can thread a needle that's never been threaded before. Maybe we'll gently unwind $20 trillion in printed money without consequences, and maybe this time really is different. But the pattern says otherwise, the math says otherwise, and history, which has watched this play out 3 times already, says we're about to learn the same lesson again, the hard way. If this has provided you with a new perspective on what's coming, subscribe, because when the pattern completes, you'll want to understand what happened and why. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look. History has shown us a destructive pattern that has led to the downfall of 3 major economies in the past century. And here we are in 2025, following that exact same pattern, step by step, number by number. It's almost as if we're reading from the same playbook that has resulted in catastrophe every single time before. In 1923, Germany fell victim to this pattern. Their currency became so devalued that people resorted to using it as wallpaper. A single loaf of bread cost a staggering 200 billion marks. Workers were compensated twice a day because the money lost half its value by lunchtime. Life savings vanished overnight, and the middle class was completely decimated. In 2008, Zimbabwe replicated this disastrous path. They printed a $100 trillion note that couldn't even buy a bus ticket. Inflation soared to an astounding 89.76 sextillion% annually, and 89 followed by 21 zeros. Prices doubled every 24 hours, leading to the literal death of the currency. In 2018, Venezuela mirrored the same pattern once again. Citizens lost an average of £24 due to their inability to afford food. Doctors were forced into prostitution just to survive. The currency plummeted, losing 99.9% of its value within a mere 5 years. A country possessing the world's largest oil reserves descended into a complete economic collapse. 3 times, 3 countries, 3 complete currency collapses, all unfolding in the exact same sequence. And here's the terrifying part. Since 2020, the United States and central banks worldwide have printed more money than all 3 of those countries combined before their respective collapses. We're not just following the pattern, we've actually accelerated it. This is the story of how nations destroy their currencies, why they consistently believe their situation is unique, and why the math suggests that we're next in line. Before we delve into the pattern, it's crucial to understand what hyperinflation truly entails. Not just theoretically, but practically, what it looks like on the streets when money loses its value. Hyperinflation is officially defined as inflation exceeding 50% per month, which means prices double every 30 days. However, when it truly takes hold, it accelerates far beyond that. In the most extreme cases, prices double every single day, or even every hour. Imagine this scenario. You go to work on Monday morning, and your salary is deposited at noon. By the time you leave at 5 p.m., that money has already lost a third of its value. The grocery store has already raised prices twice, and the gas station updates its prices every hour. You frantically rush to buy anything of real value before your money becomes worthless paper. But so is everyone else. Store shelves are emptied within hours. The cash in your pocket feels like it's burning a hole because tomorrow it will only buy half as much. Your life savings are gone, and it doesn't matter if you've been saving for 30 years because it all evaporates in a matter of weeks. Pensions become worthless, and insurance policies pay out in money that can't even buy a meal. Bonds become as valuable as toilet paper. Anyone who trusted the system, who saved in the national currency, who followed the rules, loses absolutely everything. This isn't just a theoretical scenario. It's exactly what happened in Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. And it happened because their governments did precisely what we're doing now. They printed money to solve problems that printing money simply cannot fix. And they remained convinced, right up until the very moment of collapse, that their situation was somehow different, that it couldn't possibly happen to them. Let's examine how it actually transpired 3 times in the exact same way. Let's begin with the first modern hyperinflation, Weimar Germany in 1923. This serves as the blueprint, and every hyperinflation since has followed this exact script. Following World War I, Germany faced a daunting problem. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations of 132 billion gold marks, which amounted to roughly 50,000 tons of gold, or approximately $1.4 trillion in today's money. Germany simply didn't have it. The war had devastated the economy, production was down, unemployment was rampant, and tax revenue had collapsed. So, the German government was faced with a difficult choice: default on the payments and face military occupation, or print the money to make the payments. They chose to print. And this is where every hyperinflation begins, with a government that either cannot or will not live within its means. Initially, it seemed manageable. The Reichsbank began expanding the money supply in 1919. Prices rose, but not to a catastrophic extent. The government assured people that it was temporary and necessary to rebuild the country. They urged people to trust the process. By 1921, the exchange rate was 60 marks to the dollar, which wasn't ideal, but still survivable. Then came 1922. France occupied the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland, demanding the reparations that Germany couldn't pay. Workers went on strike, and production ground to a halt. However, the government continued to pay the striking workers with printed money, more and more of it. This marks the acceleration phase, the point of no return. By the end of 1922, the exchange rate had plummeted to 7,400 marks to the dollar. Inflation was noticeable, but people still clung to the belief that the government was in control. They weren't. The printing had already crossed the line from monetary policy to monetary suicide. 1923 is when the collapse became undeniably visible. In January, the exchange rate was 17,000 marks to the dollar. By July, it had reached 350,000 marks to the dollar. In August, it soared to 4.6 million marks to the dollar. By October, it was 25 billion marks to the dollar, and in November, it reached a staggering 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. Let's put that into perspective. In January 1923, a loaf of bread cost 250 marks. By November, that same loaf cost an astronomical 200 billion marks. A single egg cost 80 billion marks, and a kilo of butter, if you could even find it, cost 6 trillion marks. Workers were paid twice a day, and they would rush to stores at lunch to spend their earnings before inflation devoured their value. Restaurants changed their prices while you were still eating, and people used wheelbarrows to carry money because it was too worthless to even bother counting. They even burned money in their fireplaces because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The middle class was utterly destroyed. Anyone who had savings in marks lost everything, and anyone on a fixed income, such as those with pensions, salaries, or bonds, was wiped out overnight. Society fractured, crime exploded, and political extremism surged. And out of that chaos emerged the Nazis. Hyperinflation didn't just destroy the currency, it destroyed the very fabric of society. It eroded faith in government, markets, and the future itself. Germany vowed that they would never allow it to happen again. But 85 years later, another country followed the exact same script, Zimbabwe in the 2000s. A country with a robust infrastructure, an educated population, and massive agricultural exports, earning it the title of the breadbasket of Africa. Then, Robert Mugabe's government made a series of decisions that would obliterate the economy in less than a decade. In 2000, the government began seizing white-owned farms and redistributing them. Agricultural production collapsed, food exports ceased, and the economy began to contract. Tax revenue plummeted, and the government faced the same choice that Germany had faced in 1919, live within their means or print money to cover the shortfall. They chose to print. In 2003, inflation hit 600%. This was bad, but not yet catastrophic.